I was raised beneath vaulted halls where the air smelled of incense and recycled breath, taught that the Imperium endures because a single will never dies. The scholar was carved into the underhive's bedrock, 5 levels below the manufactorum's, deep enough that you could feel the planet's heat rising through the stone floors. We slept in rows, 40 children to a dormitory, our cots arranged with mathematical precision, exactly 1 meter apart to prevent emotional attachment and maximize efficient movement during emergency evacuations. The instruction began before dawn, before the lumen strips flickered to life, before our stomachs had time to remind us we were hungry. The vox horns would scream the morning prayer at a volume designed to jolt you from sleep directly into devotion. The Emperor protects. The Emperor endures. His will is eternal. His throne is forever. We are nothing. He is all. We learned to mouth the words before we understood them, our lips forming sounds that meant nothing except survival. The catechisms were beaten into us, not metaphorically, though that too, but literally carved into our understanding through repetition so constant it became indistinguishable from breathing. Rote prayers and ration discipline became the pillars of our existence. You recited correctly, you ate. You hesitated, you went hungry. Simple mathematics that even a child could grasp, which was the point. Faith was not meant to be contemplated, it was meant to be obeyed. The instructors were ancient women in grey habits, their faces like weathered parchment, their eyes augmented with targeting lenses that clicked and whirred as they scanned our ranks for signs of deviation. They carried shock, mauls blessed by priests and authorized by the administratum, holy instruments of correction, each strike logged and countersigned. I learned early that questions were deviations. Why does the Emperor need a throne? A boy named Malric asked during our 7th year of instruction. He was 11, small for his age, with eyes that still held curiosity, a dangerous trait the scholar hadn't yet beaten out of him. The instructor's maul caught him across the back of the skull, with a crack that echoed through the stone hall. He dropped without a sound, blood pooling beneath his face as we continued our recitation without pause. The Emperor's throne sustains his eternal vigil. To question is to doubt is to fall. We do not question. Malric was removed by servitors during evening meal. None of us asked where he went. We'd learned that lesson, until belief felt like muscle memory rather than faith. I believed because disbelief was a crime with paperwork attached. By my 14th year, I could recite the Imperial Creed in 17 different cadences, knew all 47 approved interpretations of the Emperor's ascension, and could identify heretical thought patterns before they fully formed in my own mind. The conditioning was perfect. Thought and belief had become indistinguishable. I didn't believe the Emperor was eternal because I'd been convinced. I believed because my neural pathways had been carved into shapes that made disbelief literally unthinkable. And if I ever felt doubt, those rare, quiet moments in the dark before sleep, when something in my mind tried to ask why or how, I would crush it immediately and log it in my personal deviation journal. 3 deviations per month meant mandatory counseling. 5 meant correction. 7 meant you disappeared like Malric. I kept my journal meticulously clean. The paperwork was everywhere. Even our faith was documented, filed in triplicate, archived in data vaults that extended deeper than the scholar itself. Each prayer was logged. Each confession was recorded. Each moment of devotion was measured against baseline metrics and graphed to show your spiritual trajectory. You didn't just believe in the Emperor, you proved your belief through bureaucratic compliance. Faith without documentation was worthless, they told us. How could the Imperium function if devotion wasn't properly catalogued? Even then, whispers moved through the lines, ledger errors, missing transports, quotas that never balanced. We weren't supposed to notice. The scholar was designed to produce compliant citizens, not auditors. But some patterns were too obvious to ignore, even for minds as carefully sculpted as ours. The rations never matched the population count. We were told there were 400 children in our scholar, but the meal manifests listed provisions for 320. Where were the missing 80? Had they been transferred? Graduated early? The records never said. Transport schedules showed convoys departing the scholar twice weekly, but we only ever saw supply deliveries arrive. What were they taking away? The manifests were sealed, marked with clearance codes far above our access level, and the quotas. Emperor, the quotas. Every month, they would post our graduation requirements on data, slates mounted near the dining hall. To complete your instruction and receive assignment to productive imperial service, you needed to achieve certain metrics: devotional consistency, physical fitness, educational attainment, psychological stability. But the thresholds changed, subtly, incrementally, but constantly. One month, you needed an 85% devotional rating. The next, it was 87, then 90. The target kept moving just beyond reach, like trying to grab smoke. I watched my cohort shrink over the years. We'd started with 40 children. By year 10, there were 33. By year 15, 21. The others had graduated early, or been re-signed to specialized service, or transferred to facilities better suited to their spiritual development. The paperwork was always perfect. Signed, sealed, filed properly. But the numbers never balanced. I told myself these were tests of loyalty, not warnings. That was my first lie. Late at night, after the evening prayers and the final head count, and the lumen strips had dimmed to their minimum setting, I would lie on my cot and listen to the sounds of the schola. The distant hum of ventilation systems, the grinding of machinery from levels below, the soft weeping of newer students who hadn't yet learned that tears were emotional excess requiring documentation. And beneath it all, if you listened carefully, you could hear something else. A low vibration, more felt than heard, like the planet itself was breathing. It came from deeper still, from places we were forbidden to go, from sealed passages marked with warnings we weren't allowed to read. One of the older students, a girl named Ceres who was in her 18th year and still hadn't graduated, told me once that she'd followed the sound, had found a service corridor that led down into darkness that the lumen strips couldn't penetrate. There are doors down there, she whispered during a brief moment when the instructors weren't watching. Big ones, sealed with purity seals older than the schola, and behind them, I could hear voices, thousands of them, never stopping. I reported her the next day. It was required. Listening to unauthorized information without reporting it was conspiracy, and conspiracy was heresy, and heresy meant she disappeared that afternoon. I told myself I'd done the right thing. That loyalty to the Imperium meant loyalty to its systems, even when those systems felt wrong. Especially when they felt wrong, because doubt was just corruption wearing a friendly mask. But lying on my cot that night, I heard the vibration again. And this time, I couldn't unhear what Ceres had described, the voices, countless and unceasing, coming from somewhere beneath us. I didn't investigate, didn't follow the sound or search for those forbidden doors. I just pulled my thin blanket tighter and recited the evening prayers until sleep finally came, murmuring the words like a protective ward against thoughts I knew better than to think. The Emperor protects. The Emperor endures. His will is eternal. His throne is forever. We are nothing. He is all. And in the morning, when the Vox horns screamed their wake-up call, I rose with the others and continued my instruction as if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't heard the sound. As if the numbers still balanced. As if belief was enough. My work placed me among the administratum stacks, where numbers bled into names and names became tallies. I graduated from the schola at 19, late by their standards, but my metrics had finally aligned with whatever invisible threshold they'd set. The assignment came via data slate, delivered by a servo skull that hovered at eye level while I read the text 3 times, trying to understand what it meant for my future. Citizen designation 7739 Sigma, Sholem, completed, is hereby assigned to Administrative Sector 12 Gamma, Sub-Department of Resource Allocation and Tithe Management, Classification Junior Ledger Clerk, Grade 7. Report for duty within 12 standard hours. The Emperor protects. The administratum stacks occupied 7 levels of a hive spire so old its foundations predated the Imperium itself. The walls were lined with shelves that extended into darkness beyond what the lumen strips could illuminate, each shelf packed with data, slates, parchment scrolls, punch card archives, and filing systems whose organizational logic had been lost millennia ago, but which no one dared change, because change required authorization from departments that might no longer exist. My station was a metal desk in a chamber filled with 200 identical desks, each occupied by a clerk whose face I would never learn, whose name I would never speak. We worked in silence except for the soft clicking of styluses on slates, the rustling of parchment, and the distant grinding of the archival servitors that moved through the stacks on predetermined routes, their augmetic legs clicking against stone floors with mechanical precision. I learned that maintenance required a constant intake, recorded as losses, donations, or reassignments. The ledgers assigned to me dealt with population management, specifically the intake and allocation of what the administratum classified as renewable human resources. The terminology was deliberately vague, bureaucratic language designed to create distance between the clerk and the reality of what they were documenting. Each entry followed the same format. The word consumed appeared frequently. I asked my supervisor, a woman whose augmetic jaw clicked when she spoke, what it meant in this context. Resource allocation completed. She replied without looking up from her own ledger. Units processed according to specification. Standard terminology. Continue your work. But I'd been trained to read between administrative lines, to find patterns in data that weren't supposed to have patterns. And the patterns here were impossible to ignore. Every month, without fail, approximately 12,000 units were classified as consumed in the maintenance category, not recycled, not reassigned, not terminated, consumed. And the destinations were always the same, a series of facility codes I didn't recognize, locations that appeared nowhere in the standard Imperial geographic databases. Bodies were resources, suffering was amortized. The more I worked with the numbers, the more I understood the system's terrible efficiency. The Imperium didn't waste anything, not even pain. Every aspect of human suffering was quantified, categorized, and allocated according to need. A worker who died in a manufacturing accident wasn't just a casualty. They were a resource whose useful lifespan had been exhausted prematurely, their remaining biomass to be rendered down, and their loss recorded as an efficiency variance requiring correction in next quarter's projections. A prisoner sentenced to penal servitude wasn't being punished. They were being reallocated from civilian resource pool to corrective labor pool, their suffering measured in productivity metrics, and their eventual death logged as acceptable depreciation. Children who failed to complete their scholar instruction weren't simply failing. They were being reclassified from potential productive citizens to immediate consumption resources, their deviation from acceptable parameters making them suitable for more specialized applications. The ledgers documented everything. Each scream had a reference number. Each death had a filing code. Each moment of agony was amortized across fiscal projections that extended centuries into the future. Each stamp on a form echoed like a hammer strike on a coffin. I processed hundreds of entries per day, thousands per week. By my third month, I'd documented the intake and consumption of over 90,000 units without ever seeing a single face, hearing a single voice, acknowledging a single individual existence. My stylus moved across the data, slate with practiced efficiency, verify origin, confirm quantity, validate destination codes, stamp approval, file in triplicate, move to next entry. The rhythm became automatic, meditative, a prayer offered to the god of bureaucratic necessity. But late at night, alone in my hab unit, I would look at my hands and see the phantom ink stains from all those stamps. 90,000 approvals, 90,000 consumptions, 90,000 lives reduced to lines in a ledger that no one would ever read except to verify that the quotas had been met. I began to feel the cost before I understood it. The physical toll came first, headaches that started behind my eyes and spread like cracks in ceramite, spreading until my entire skull felt too small to contain my brain. The medica servitor I was assigned to told me it was eye strain from too many hours reading data, slates, prescribed me drops and sent me back to work. But the drops didn't help because the pain wasn't physical. It was cognitive dissonance made manifest, my mind trying to reconcile what I'd been taught with what I was documenting. The Emperor protects, they'd told us. The Emperor endures. His will is eternal. But if his will was eternal, why did it require 90,000 consumptions per month, just in my sector alone? If his protection was absolute, Why did the ledgers show a constant, unchanging demand for resources that could only be human lives measured and allocated like grain or promethium? I started noticing patterns in the destination codes. Certain facilities received regular shipments, not random allocations, but precise quotas maintained with mathematical consistency. One facility, coded as TF Omega Centi US, received exactly 4,000 units every 30 days. Not 31 days, not 29, exactly 30, as if something there operated on a schedule that couldn't tolerate variance. Another facility, TH Ryani, PPRIME, received smaller quantities but with greater frequency, 200 units every 3 days, like clockwork, like feeding, like something vast and hungry required constant sustenance to continue functioning. I tried to access the facility registries to learn where these places were and what purpose they served. But the files were sealed, marked with clearance codes far above my grade, protected by security protocols that would flag any unauthorized access attempt. So I did what any good clerk does. I extrapolated from available data. If TFO Media CNTUS consumed 4,000 units monthly, and my sector was only one of approximately 800 sectors managing similar ledgers, then the total monthly consumption across the Imperium's administrative network would be. I stopped calculating when the number exceeded 3 billion. 3 billion units per month, every month, forever. The scale was incomprehensible, monstrous. And yet the ledgers showed it with clinical precision. Documented with the same bureaucratic indifference we applied to shipments of bolter ammunition or agricultural tithers. Whatever was being maintained required an ocean of human lives to sustain it, and we, all of us clerks in our silent chambers, all of us functionaries processing forms, we were the ones who kept that ocean flowing. Each stamp of approval was a life redirected from whatever it might have been toward consumption in service of something we weren't cleared to understand. I began having dreams, not nightmares exactly, nothing so dramatic as that, just images of numbers scrolling endlessly, each digit representing a person I would never meet, whose death I had authorized with a stylus stroke. Sometimes the numbers had faces, sometimes they had voices, whispering designation codes as they vanished into data, streams that led nowhere I could follow. I would wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat despite the HAB, units temperature controls, and I would reach for my data slate to document the deviation in my personal compliance log. Subject experienced disturbing dreams related to work assignment. Duration approximately 47 minutes before waking. Emotional response moderate distress. Recommended action increased devotional time to restore proper perspective. The dreams continued. The numbers continued. The consumption continued. And I continued stamping approvals, because what else could I do? The system was vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond questioning, necessary beyond doubt. The Emperor protects, the Emperor endures, and somewhere, in facilities I would never see, something consumed the lives I documented with the same industrial efficiency we applied to everything else in this endlessly grinding Imperium. I began to feel the cost, but I didn't yet understand it. That would come later, when they reassigned me deeper. I was reassigned to a sealed sub-level, a place where the walls hummed with low, endless sound. The notice arrived without warning, appearing in my work queue alongside the usual allocation reports and consumption manifests. The text was terse, marked with security seals I'd never seen before. Not the standard administrator emblems, but something older, bearing symbols that hurt to look at directly. Clerk 7739, Sigma Admin 12 is hereby transferred to Special Assignment Sub, Level Archival Operations Palace District, Terror Adjacent Processing. Security clearance upgraded to Amber 7, report immediately. Disclosure violations carry termination sanction. The Emperor protects. Terror Adjacent. I read those words 3 times, my hands trembling slightly as I held the data slate. Terra was the throne world, the heart of the Imperium, the sacred seat from which the Emperor's eternal will radiated across the galaxy. I'd never expected to see it, even from a distance. The journey took 6 days via sealed transport, cramped compartments where 20 of us sat in silence, none daring to ask why we'd been selected or where exactly we were going. We were all clerks, all pulled from different administrative sectors, all bearing the same amber clearance codes and the same expression of confused compliance. When we finally arrived, they processed us through security checkpoints so thorough it felt like they were cataloging our souls. Biometric scans, genetic verification, psychological evaluations, loyalty assessments. We were stripped, examined, documented, and issued new uniforms, grey jumpsuits marked with facility codes, and warning symbols whose meanings we weren't told. Then they took us down. The air tasted metallic, thick with ozone and antiseptic. The descent lasted hours, traveling through lift shafts that plunged deeper than any structure should extend, past levels marked with designation codes that grew progressively more ancient as we descended. The walls changed texture, polished metal gave way to worked stone. Worked stone gave way to bedrock carved with symbols that predated the Imperium. Bedrock gave way to something else, something that looked almost organic, as if we were descending into the throat of some vast creature. The sound began halfway down. At first, I thought it was machinery, the usual grinding and humming of a functioning hive. But as we descended further, the sound resolved into something more specific, more terrible. Voices, not speaking, not singing, not chanting, something between all three, a continuous vocalization that never paused for breath, never resolved into coherent words, never stopped. The lift doors opened onto a corridor carved from black stone, lit by lumen strips that flickered at irregular intervals, casting shadows that moved wrong. The sound was louder here, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself. Our escort, a tech priest whose face was mostly hidden behind a rebreather, gestured us forward with a mechadendrite. "Welcome to Archive Sub, Level Sanctus 9. Your duties will be explained momentarily. Do not deviate from designated pathways. Do not attempt to access sealed chambers. Do not speak unnecessarily. Violation of these protocols results in immediate reassignment to primary systems." Primary systems. The way he said it made clear that reassignment wasn't promotion. I heard voices, thousands, never in unison, never stopping, each one broken into a prayer shaped by pain. The archive chamber was vast, impossibly vast for something this deep underground. The ceiling vanished into darkness that the lumen strips couldn't penetrate. The walls were lined with what I first took to be filing cabinets, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were something else. Alcoves. Thousands of them, arranged in precise geometric patterns, each one occupied by a figure suspended in some kind of apparatus. Tubes ran from their bodies to conduits in the walls. Wires connected to their skulls, their spines, their major nerve clusters. Their mouths were held open by metal frames, preventing them from closing, forcing them to continue the vocalization that created that terrible sound. They called it a choir, but no song ever ended. My supervisor, a woman whose name I never learned, whose face was hidden behind a filtration mask, briefed us with clinical efficiency. "You are now assigned to Psychic Sustainment Operations, Archive Division. Your role is documentation and maintenance verification. Each unit must be monitored for optimal output. Degradation rates must be logged. Replacement schedules must be maintained." Questions. I had thousands of questions. Instead, I asked the only one that felt safe. "What are we documenting?" She consulted her data slate, as if the answer might be written there. "Units designated for throne maintenance operations. They provide psychic sustenance to critical Imperial systems. Each unit maintains vocalization patterns that generate measurable psychic energy, which is then channeled to Terra Prime via astropathic relay networks." "For how long?" someone else asked. "Until degradation reaches terminal threshold. Typically 14 to 18 months of optimal function, followed by declining output, followed by replacement." Very efficient. Next question. No one asked anything else. We'd all learned the same lesson in our respective institutions. Some truths are safer left unexamined. I realized the sound wasn't praise, it was fuel. My station was a monitoring console overlooking Sector 7 Gamma, which housed approximately 2,000 units arranged in concentric circles. My data slate displayed their vital signs in real-time: heart rates, neural activity, psychic output measured in units I didn't recognize, degradation percentages, color, coded from green to red. Most hovered around yellow, 60 to 70% degraded. A few were still green, new arrivals not yet worn down by months of forced vocalization. Several had tipped into red, their output dropping below minimal thresholds. their bodies failing even as the apparatus kept forcing sound through their ruined throats. I watched the numbers for hours, learning the rhythm of the system. Every 6 hours, servitors would arrive to replace the red units, disconnecting them from the apparatus with mechanical efficiency, dragging them away to wherever failed units were processed. New units would be brought in, unconscious, freshly prepared, and connected to the systems, their bodies jerking as the psychic machinery activated and forced them into vocalization. The sound never stopped. It just refreshed, like changing a battery before the device powers down completely. I tried to look at their faces once. Tried to see them as people rather than numbers on my screen, but the apparatus held their features frozen in expressions I couldn't quite pass, not quite agony, not quite ecstasy, something beyond either that human faces weren't designed to express. I looked away, focused on the numbers. The numbers were clean. The numbers didn't have eyes that tracked movement, even though their bodies couldn't turn. The numbers didn't make you feel complicit in something so vast and terrible that understanding it would break whatever remained of your conscience. The shift lasted 12 hours. By the end, my hands shook as I filed the reports, documenting optimal output levels, noting which units had been replaced, recommending adjustments to the psychic channeling parameters based on performance metrics. I had documented the consumption of 47 units. 47 people reduced to exhausted psychic batteries, dragged away to be rendered down while fresh units took their places. 47 people who had been screaming prayers for 18 months straight, their voices blending into fuel for something I wasn't cleared to fully understand. The Emperor protects, I told myself as I filed the reports. The Emperor endures, I whispered as I watched the servitors drag away another red unit. His will is eternal, I repeated like a mantra, as I tried not to think about where the units came from, about whether any of them had been children in scholars like mine, about whether the ledgers I'd processed in my previous assignment had been sending people here. I felt a tug behind my eyes, as if something inside me was being measured for fit. The tech priest noticed me rubbing my temples during the shift change. His augmetic eyes clicked as they focused on my face, analyzing, assessing. First cycle disorientation is normal, he said, his voice flat through the Vox synthesizer. Psychic proximity effects. Your system is adjusting to the ambient energy levels. If symptoms persist beyond 3 cycles, report to medical for evaluation. Evaluation for what? Suitability assessment. He gestured toward the alcoves with a mechadendrite. Not everyone can maintain administrative distance from the materials. Some become sympathetically entangled. Those individuals are often better suited for primary assignment. Primary assignment. The units in the alcoves. The voices in the choir. I understood then what I'd felt, that tug behind my eyes, that sensation of being measured. The psychic machinery didn't just draw from the units in the alcoves. It drew from everyone in proximity, testing, tasting, evaluating who might be suitable for more direct contribution. Survival, I learned, was conditional. I returned to my assigned hab that night and lay in the dark, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. The sound followed me. Even this far from the archive level, even through layers of stone and metal, I could hear it. Or perhaps I was just remembering it. Or perhaps it had always been there, beneath everything, and I'd simply never been deep enough to notice. The voices, thousands of them, never in unison, never stopping, singing prayers that were really just screaming, fueling something vast and terrible and absolutely necessary. I pulled my thin blanket over my head and whispered my own prayer, hoping it would be enough to keep me on this side of the apparatus, in the safe world of numbers and documentation, rather than in the terrible world of direct contribution. The Emperor protects. The Emperor endures. His will is eternal. But for the first time, I wondered he protects us from what? Sustains what exactly? And for how much longer? The engines there were ancient and hungry, wrapped in purity seals like bandages on a corpse that refused to cool. After 3 months of monitoring duties, I received clearance for deeper access, not a promotion exactly, but a lateral reassignment that took me from the observation decks to the maintenance corridors that ran between the alcoves, where the machinery's true nature became impossible to ignore. The engines occupied the spaces behind the walls, vast mechanisms that predated the Imperium by millennia, perhaps longer. No one knew who had built them originally, or for what purpose. The tech priests who maintained them spoke in reverent whispers about archaeotech and sacred systems and emperor-blessed machinery, but their prayers had the quality of apology, as if they were asking forgiveness for working with something they didn't truly understand and couldn't fully control. The purity seals covered every surface, thousands of them overlapping like scales, each one inscribed with prayers meant to sanctify technology that might otherwise be considered too dangerous for human interaction. They fluttered in the hot air that rose from the machinery's depths, creating a constant susurrus that blended with the choir's endless vocalization. But beneath the seals, you could see the truth: the metal was wrong. Not corroded, that would have been natural, expected. This was something else. The surfaces looked organic in places, as if the machinery had been growing rather than built, adapting itself to its function over tens of thousands of years. Tubes ran from holding pens into metal throats that pulsed with a wet rhythm. My new duties required me to inspect the intake systems, the mechanisms that connected the units in the alcoves to the engines that consumed their psychic output. The tubes were translucent, allowing you to see what flowed through them if you looked closely, which I tried not to do, but couldn't always avoid. The fluid wasn't blood, though it had blood's color. It moved wrong, too thick in some sections, too thin in others, pulsing arrhythmically as if the machinery itself had a heartbeat that didn't quite match human cardiac rhythm. When the tubes connected to a new unit, you could see the fluid surge, rushing toward the fresh connection like something eager. The holding pens were where they prepared the units before connection. I'd seen them during my monitoring duties, but only as numbers on a screen, statistics in a database. Walking among them was different. The pens were arranged in rows, each one a small cell barely large enough for a human body to lie down. The occupants were sedated but not unconscious. Their eyes tracked movement. Their mouths moved soundlessly. Their hands twitched against restraints that kept them from interfering with the preparation process. Medicae servitors moved between the pens with mechanical precision, administering injections, attaching preliminary connections, running diagnostic scans to ensure each unit would provide optimal output once fully integrated into the system. They worked in silence except for the soft clicking of their augmetic components and the occasional hiss of a pneumatic syringe. I tried not to look at the units' faces, tried to maintain the professional distance I'd cultivated during my monitoring shifts. But at this proximity, that distance became impossible to maintain. They were young, most of them, late teens, early 20s, the age when psychic potential was highest, when the mind was still flexible enough to be shaped by the apparatus, when the body could sustain months of forced vocalization without immediate failure. They looked like the children from my scholar, like the ones who'd been re-signed to specialized service, like the 80 missing from our meal manifests, the ones whose disappearance I'd told myself was just administrative error. I realized, standing there in the holding pens with the wet sound of machinery pulsing around me, that there had been no error. The quotas had been exact, the numbers had balanced perfectly. They'd always been feeding this. Technicians never looked at us, only at gauges that dipped and rose with screams. The maintenance crews worked in the spaces between the alcoves, monitoring pressure readings and psychic output levels and structural integrity of the ancient machinery. They wore sealed suits that protected them from the psychic radiation, their faces hidden behind darkened visors. Their voices filtered through vox, systems that made them sound mechanical, distant. They moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, checking connections, adjusting flow rates, replacing components that had worn beyond acceptable tolerance. When a tube connection failed, happened occasionally, the organic metal interface breaking down, they would seal off the affected alcove, disconnect the degraded unit, and dispose of it through chutes that led somewhere I wasn't cleared to access. I watched one such disposal during my second week in maintenance. The unit had been connected for approximately 16 months, their degradation percentage in the high 90s. their psychic output barely registering on the monitoring systems. The technician approached with a tool I didn't recognize, applied it to the connection points, and the apparatus released with a wet, sucking sound. The unit collapsed immediately, their body no longer supported by the machinery that had been keeping them upright for over a year. Their mouth tried to close, but the muscles had atrophied beyond function. Their eyes moved, focusing on nothing, seeing everything. The technician consulted a gauge on his wrist, made a notation on his data slate, and used a mechadendrite to push the body toward the disposal chute. It slid away into darkness without sound, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that it had been a person rather than a depleted resource. The technician moved to the next alcove and continued his inspection. I wanted to ask if the units were conscious during their connection, if they knew what was happening to them, if the endless vocalization was voluntary or forced, prayer or screaming or something that had long since stopped distinguishing between the two. But the technicians never looked at us, never acknowledged the administrative staff except to request documentation or report maintenance needs. They lived in a world of gauges and readings and mechanical tolerances, and anything that fell outside those parameters simply didn't exist. I felt a tug behind my eyes, as if something inside me was being measured for fit. The sensation had grown stronger since my reassignment to maintenance duties. No longer a vague pressure, but something more specific, a pulling, a testing, like fingers probing at the edges of my consciousness to see where it might be pried open. The medica servitor who conducted my weekly health assessment noticed the change in my neural readings. Subject displays elevated psychic sensitivity. It intoned, its voice flat and synthesized. Proximity exposure increasing baseline receptivity. Recommend immediate evaluation for primary assignment suitability. I'm fine, I said quickly, just tired, the shifts are long. Fatigue is irrelevant to psychic compatibility assessment. The servitor's optical sensors focused on my face with clicking precision. Subject's neural patterns indicate potential for optimal energy output. Primary assignment would maximize Imperial resource efficiency. It was offering me a promotion. From documenting the machinery to becoming part of it. From monitoring the consumption to being consumed. I decline, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm more useful in my current role. Documentation requires human judgment that servitors can't provide. The servitor processed this for 3 full seconds, an eternity by its computational standards, before making a notation on its data slate. Declination recorded. Subject preference noted. Evaluation postponed pending performance review. However, psychic sensitivity will continue increasing with proximity exposure. Eventual reassignment probability, 93%. 93%. The number followed me back to my station, haunted my monitoring duties, echoed through my thoughts during the long hours between shifts. Survival, I learned, was conditional. You could refuse once, maybe twice. But the machinery was always testing, always measuring, always looking for optimal fits. And if your psychic signature matched the profile they needed, if your neural patterns aligned with the engine's requirements, then your preferences became irrelevant, overridden by Imperial resource management protocols that valued efficiency over individual consent. I had perhaps 6 months, the servitor's assessment implied, before my sensitivity crossed the threshold and my reassignment became mandatory rather than optional. 6 months to remain on this side of the apparatus. 6 months before I would join the choir, my voice adding to that endless sound. My consciousness stretched thin across 18 months of forced vocalization, until degradation reached terminal levels, and I was disposed of through those dark chutes. That night, I lay in my hab and felt the tug intensify. The machinery was teaching my nervous system to resonate with its frequency, training my psychic potential to align with its needs, grooming me for eventual consumption. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. Nothing except continue my duties, file my reports, document the consumption of others while waiting for my turn. The engines were hungry, and I was beginning to realize that everything in the Imperium, every system, every protocol, every prayer we'd been taught since childhood, existed to feed them. My turn came quietly, summoned by a notice stamped in red and countersigned by 3 departments. 5 months and 11 days after my reassignment to maintenance duties. I'd been counting, tracking my degradation in private logs I kept encrypted on my personal data slate, watching the progression of my psychic sensitivity as it crept from yellow into orange, approaching the red threshold that would make my reassignment mandatory rather than merely probable. The notice appeared in my morning queue, nestled between routine maintenance reports and shift schedules. The header was marked PRIORAM and DO80, the text brief and absolute. Clerk 7739 Sigma Maint, Sanctus is hereby reassigned to Primary Systems Integration, effective immediately. Report to Medical Preparation Bay 7 within 2 standard hours. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be noted and addressed. The Emperor protects. I read it 3 times, my hands steady despite the fear that had turned my stomach to ice. Part of me had expected this, had been preparing for it, in the way you prepare for inevitable death, not hoping to prevent it, just trying to make peace with the certainty. But another part of me, some stubborn fragment that had survived the scholar and the ledgers, and the months of watching others be consumed, that part screamed silently, uselessly, into the void of my compliance. I deleted the notice, filed my current reports, collected my personal effects, a data slate containing nothing the administratum didn't already know, a set of prayer beads I'd been issued during scholar, and a tin aquila so cheap its edges had started to corrode. Then I walked to Medical Preparation Bay 7. They shaved me, weighed me, corrected my posture, and thanked me for my service. The preparation process was efficient, clinical, almost gentle. A medica servitor welcomed me with synthesized courtesy, gesturing toward a preparation chamber where 6 other subjects waited in various stages of processing. We were given gowns, thin, gray, open at the back, and directed to stations where our bodies would be optimized for integration. Hair was removed completely, reducing the risk of contamination. Weight was measured and adjusted, if necessary, through immediate nutrient supplementation or reduction. Posture was corrected via brief skeletal realignment that left me gasping but straighter. A human medica, rare to see one rather than a servitor, examined my neural scan results and nodded with what might have been approval. Excellent psychic resonance, she said, not to me, but to her data slate, documenting her observations. Baseline compatibility 97%. Estimated optimal duration 19 to 21 months. Well above average. The Emperor is fortunate in your service. 19 to 21 months. That's how long I would scream before degradation reached terminal levels, and they disposed of me. Nearly 2 years of forced vocalization, my consciousness stretched thin, my body kept alive by machinery, while my mind was harvested for the psychic energy it could produce. Thank you, I heard myself say. The words came automatically, drilled into me by decades of conditioning. Thank them for measuring how long you'll suffer. Thank them for the privilege of being consumed. The medici made a notation. Subject displays appropriate gratitude response. Psychological readiness confirmed. Needles bit deep, cold blooming through my veins as restraints closed. The preparation table was made of metal that had been warmed to body temperature, a small mercy that made the restraints closing around my wrists and ankles feel less like imprisonment and more like embrace. The needles came next, sliding into veins with practiced precision, delivering fluids I couldn't identify by color or sensation. The cold spread from the injection sites like frost across glass, numbing but not quite painless. I could feel my body's temperature dropping, my heartbeat slowing, my breathing becoming shallow and regular as the chemicals took effect. Sedation protocol initiated. A servitor announced, subject will remain conscious during integration, but physiological distress responses will be suppressed. This ensures optimal psychic output during initial connection phase. Conscious. They wanted me awake for this. Wanted me to feel the machinery connect, to experience the moment when my body stopped being mine and became a component in something vastly larger and infinitely more important than individual existence. I tried to pray, but the words slid away, replaced by a roaring warmth that pulled at my thoughts. The words of the Imperial Creed had been my anchor since childhood, the one constant in a life measured by compliance and documentation. I reached for them now. The Emperor protects, the Emperor endures. but they dissolved before I could grasp them, melting like ice in a furnace as something else pushed into the space where my thoughts used to be. Warmth. Not the comfortable warmth of a heated hab or the satisfying warmth of hot food, but something deeper, more invasive. It flowed through my veins alongside the injected chemicals, spread through my nervous system like liquid fire that didn't quite burn. Filled every hollow space in my consciousness with a presence that was not me, had never been me, but was using me as a vessel for something I couldn't comprehend. The psychic machinery was waking up inside me, teaching my neurons to resonate with frequencies human brains weren't designed to process, turning my consciousness into a conduit for energies that would, over the next 19 to 21 months, slowly burn me away from the inside. They moved me to the integration chamber while I was still conscious but incapable of resistance. My body slack from the sedation, my mind overwhelmed by the roaring presence that had invaded it. The chamber was one of thousands I'd monitored from my station, an alcove carved from black stone, fitted with the apparatus that would hold me upright and force my throat to continue vocalizing even when my conscious mind had long since fragmented beyond coherent thought. The connection points touched my spine, my skull, the major nerve clusters along my torso. Each contact sent a jolt through my system, not painful, but wrongly intimate, as if something was reaching inside me and rearranging my internal geography to better suit its purposes. The throat apparatus came last, forcing my jaw open, positioning my tongue and vocal cords for optimal sound production. I wanted to scream, wanted to beg them to stop, to reconsider, to acknowledge that I was a person rather than a resource to be consumed. But the only sound that emerged was the beginning of the vocalization, a low, droning tone that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a scream, something between prayer and agony that would continue, they'd told me, for the next 19 to 21 months. In that moment, immortality felt like a mouth closing. The machinery activated fully, and I felt myself being pulled in multiple directions at once. Part of me was still present, the observer, the clerk, the person who'd been raised in scholars and trained to document rather than question. That part watched in horror as the rest of me was stretched thin. My consciousness diluted across the psychic channels the engines required. I could feel the other units connected to the same system, thousands of them, all vocalizing, all being consumed, all feeding the vast machinery that sustained something we weren't cleared to fully understand, but which required our sacrifice to continue functioning. And through the roaring presence, and the forced vocalization, and the sensation of being slowly unmade, I finally understood what we were feeding. Not the Emperor himself, that would have been too simple, too clean. We were feeding the machinery that kept him from dying. We were the fuel that sustained his endless agony on the golden throne, our psychic energy channeled through systems so ancient their original purpose had been lost, our suffering converted to the power required to keep a corpse, God, from finally achieving the release of death. Immortality wasn't preservation. It was consumption, an ocean of human lives pouring themselves endlessly into a mechanism that existed only to prevent one life from ending. 10,000 years of this. Billions upon billions of people reduced to fuel, their prayers and screams indistinguishable, their consciousness harvested to sustain a throne that had long since become a tomb, and I was part of it now. My voice joined the choir, adding my vocalization to the endless sound that powered the engines, that fed the throne, that held the Emperor in his eternal, terrible existence. 19 to 21 months. That's how long I would last before degradation reached terminal levels, and they disconnected me and disposed of my used-up body. 19 to 21 months of screaming prayers I could no longer distinguish from agony. 19 to 21 months of being slowly consumed to sustain immortality that had become indistinguishable from damnation. The machinery drank, and I, like billions before me, became the offering it required. I do not know how long I was suspended between breaths, only that time lost its edges. The vocalization continued without pause, but my experience of it became strange, discontinuous. Sometimes I was aware of the sound leaving my throat, the vibration in my chest, the mechanical rhythm of the apparatus forcing air through my damaged vocal cords. Other times I seemed to exist somewhere else entirely, not physically, but as pure consciousness untethered from the body that screamed endlessly in its alcove. The machinery didn't just harvest psychic energy. It changed the nature of time itself within its influence, stretching some moments into subjective eternities, while compressing months into what felt like seconds. You could experience 19 months of vocalization in what felt like a single extended scream, or you could live through every individual second of suffering with perfect, terrible clarity. I experienced both, and neither, and something in between that human language has no words for. Memories were siphoned like spoiled coolant, leaving clean hollows behind. The extraction began subtly, so subtly I didn't notice at first. Small things would disappear from my internal landscape, the name of a street near my childhood scholar, the face of an instructor whose discipline had shaped my early years, the taste of a particular meal I'd once found comforting. These weren't memories the machinery needed for its function, so it discarded them, creating space for the psychic energies it was channeling through my consciousness. Like clearing data from an overloaded system, except the data was my life, my identity, everything that had made me a person rather than a tool. I tried to hold on to things, tried to anchor myself with important memories, my designation, my work history, the faces of people I'd known. But the machinery was patient and thorough, peeling away each layer of self like removing insulation from a wire, stripping me down to the bare conductor required for energy transmission. My childhood scholar dissolved into vague impressions, stone walls, the smell of incense, the taste of protein paste, the specific details, which corridor led to which chamber, which instructors had been cruel versus merely indifferent, which children had disappeared and which had survived. All of that became fog, then mist, then nothing. My time in the administratum stacks fared no better. I remembered processing ledgers, remembered the stamp of approval, remembered the terrible weight of documenting 90,000 lives. But the individual entries blurred together, became a single endless scroll of numbers without context, data without meaning. Even my name, the birth name I'd carried before they gave me a designation, that vanished too. I reached for it one day and found only empty space where it should have been. The designation remained 7739 Sigma, but the person who'd been given a name by parents whose faces I could no longer remember. Gone, cleaned away, siphoned, disposed of to make room for the machinery's requirements. I sensed others with me, not as faces but as pressure, countless, compressed into purpose. The connection to the apparatus wasn't individual. We weren't separate units experiencing separate suffering. The machinery bound us together, thousands of consciousnesses compressed into a single psychic resonance, our individual identities dissolving into a collective scream that was more efficient than the sum of its parts. I could feel them, not see them, not hear them, but feel them, the weight of their presence, the texture of their suffering, the specific frequency of their psychic output. Some were new, still fighting, still trying to maintain the boundaries of self. Others were old, worn so thin they were barely distinguishable from the machinery itself. We didn't communicate. Communication required individuality, language, the concept of self and other. We were beyond that. We were a choir in the truest sense, many voices producing one sound, many minds generating one current of psychic energy. Sometimes I would sense a particular pressure fade, its texture smoothing out until it became indistinguishable from background noise. A unit reaching terminal degradation, consciousness worn away to nothing, body discarded. The machinery would pause fractionally, barely noticeable, as servitors disconnected the failed unit and integrated a fresh one. The new presence would surge into our collective awareness, confusion, fear, the desperate attempt to hold on to identity. We couldn't warn them, couldn't offer comfort or explanation, could only absorb them into our resonance, their frequency aligning with ours, their screams joining our scream. Pain became a distant metric, something noted but not felt. The apparatus managed pain with perfect efficiency. Not eliminating it, pain was useful, produced certain psychic harmonics the machinery required, but regulating it, keeping it at optimal levels that maximized output without causing premature failure. Physical pain existed as data: throat damage 73%, muscular atrophy 81%, neural degradation 54%. I could perceive these numbers as abstract information, understand that my body was failing, but the experiential reality of that failure was muffled, processed through layers of chemical and psychic management until suffering became just another parameter to be optimized. The worst pain wasn't physical. It was the pain of dissolution, of feeling yourself being slowly erased, your memories extracted, your consciousness compressed into pure function. That pain the apparatus couldn't fully manage because it was intrinsic to the process, necessary to the conversion of human consciousness into psychic fuel. I understood then that the secret was not life preserved, but lives consumed. The revelation came not as thought, but as direct perception, unfiltered by the mental frameworks that usually protect consciousness from truths too terrible to process. The machinery didn't hide its purpose from us. We were too integrated into its function for deception to be necessary or useful. We weren't sustaining the Emperor's life. We were preventing his death. Those are different things. Life implies vitality, consciousness, will. The Emperor possessed none of these, not anymore. What sat on the golden throne was a corpse kept from decay through mechanisms so ancient and terrible that their original architects would have wept to see them still functioning millennia after they should have failed. The machinery didn't preserve, it postponed. Every day, every hour, every second, the Emperor should have died. His body was beyond repair, his consciousness fragmented beyond recovery, his power exhausted beyond restoration. Death should have claimed him 10,000 years ago, but the machinery wouldn't let him die. It held him in that moment between breath and stillness, between consciousness and void, sustaining the unsustainable through the consumption of lives that were themselves being held in moments between existence and dissolution. We were being unmade to prevent his unmaking. Our suffering was the price of his eternal suffering. Our slow dissolution powered his eternal imprisonment in flesh that longed for the release of death, but couldn't achieve it, because the machinery required him to continue existing, and the machinery was fed by us, and we were fed to the machinery by an Imperium that believed it was preserving something sacred rather than perpetuating something damned. Immortality wasn't a gift. It was a curse so profound that billions had to be sacrificed to sustain it. And we, all of us in the choir, all of us dissolved into psychic resonance. We understood this with perfect clarity because we were experiencing the same imprisonment, the same inability to die, the same endless moment stretched across months or years or subjective eternities. I wanted to rage against it. Wanted to fight, to resist, to deny the machinery its function. But I had no self left to rebel with, no identity distinct enough from the collective to assert individual will. I was a frequency, a current of energy flowing through systems that had been designed by minds that understood suffering as a resource more precious than promethium or adamantium. Time dissolved, self dissolved, everything dissolved except the vocalization. The endless sound that was prayer and scream and plea and curse all compressed into one continuous note that powered machinery, that prevented death, that should have been mercy millennia ago. And in that dissolution, I finally understood why the Imperium endured, not through faith, not through strength, not through the Emperor's will, but through us. Through the billions fed into machinery that converted human consciousness into the power required to sustain the unsustainable, preserve the unpreservable, postpone the inevitable for just one more day, one more century, one more millennium. The Imperium endured because we were consumed to fuel its endurance. And we had no choice but to continue because the machinery had taken away the ability to choose, had dissolved the self that might have chosen, had reduced us to pure function in service of immortality that had long since become indistinguishable from damnation. I existed in that space without time, without self, without anything except the awareness that I was fuel, was being burned, would continue burning until there was nothing left to burn, and then they would replace me with someone else, and the machinery would continue, and the Emperor would continue not dying, forever. They returned me altered, stamped, released, and sent back into the hive with a ration chit and a scar I could not explain. The disconnection came suddenly, or perhaps gradually, time having lost all meaning during my integration. One moment I was part of the choir, my consciousness dissolved into the collective resonance. The next, I was being pulled away. The machinery releasing its hold not because I'd served my full term, but because something in my psychic signature had changed in ways that made me unsuitable for continued consumption. I learned later, through overheard conversations between Medicare servitors, that this happened sometimes. Approximately 3% of integrated units developed resistance, not conscious resistance, but a cellular-level rejection of the machinery's function that manifested as psychic static interference that degraded output quality below acceptable thresholds. The machinery had no use for units that fought back at a level below conscious thought. So it released them, expelled them from the system like foreign matter from a wound. Their bodies still functional, but their minds carrying imprints of what they'd experienced. They processed my disconnection with clinical efficiency, removed the apparatus, cleaned the connection points, administered treatments to accelerate physical recovery. My throat was damaged but not destroyed, vocal cords scarred, larynx partially collapsed, capable of speech, but forever marked by months of forced vocalization. 19 months. I'd been connected for 19 months, though I remembered it as both an eternity and an instant. Time having lost coherence during my dissolution, they issued me new documentation, Subject 7739, Sigma Integration Complete Released, cleared for reintegration into standard Imperial service with medical classification, partially degraded but functional. Assignment pending psychological evaluation, aeration chit for the coming week. A data slate containing my updated medical records, a grey jumpsuit to replace the preparation gown, and a scar along my spine where the primary connection had been, raised tissue that would ache in certain weather. A permanent reminder of what I'd been used for. They released me into the transit system with no explanation, no debriefing, no acknowledgement of what I'd experienced. Just another processed unit, returned to circulation, documentation filed in triplicate. I moved through crowds who cheered the idea of forever. Unaware of the drain beneath their feet, the hive looked different. Or perhaps I looked at it differently. My perception altered by months of dissolution and reformation. The crowds that filled the transit stations and work corridors moved with such innocent purpose, their faces showing concern only for immediate things, shift assignments, ration allocations, devotional attendance. They celebrated the Emperor's eternal vigilance, sang prayers of gratitude for his endless protection, praised the golden throne that sustained his immortal will. Their faith was absolute, pure, untouched by the knowledge of what that immortality actually required. I wanted to grab them, shake them, force them to understand, but my damaged throat could barely manage a whisper, and even if I could have spoken clearly, what would I have said? Your prayers are fuel. Your children are being fed to machinery that prevents a corpse from dying. The Imperium endures because billions are consumed to sustain it, and you will be next. And your faith will not save you because your faith is what marks you as suitable for consumption. They wouldn't have believed me. Couldn't have believed me. The conditioning ran too deep, the infrastructure of faith too thoroughly constructed. To question the Emperor's immortality was to question everything, the purpose of suffering, the meaning of service, the entire framework of imperial existence. Better to remain ignorant. Easier to believe the lie. The hymns sounded different now, like in voices sung aloud. I found work in a data processing facility, far from the administratum stacks where I'd once documented consumption. My damaged voice prevented me from prayer, leading positions, and my medical classification made me unsuitable for positions requiring security clearance. But I could still process numbers, still verify manifests, still perform the basic clerical functions that kept the Imperium's bureaucracy grinding forward. The other workers ignored me, put off by my scars and my silence, and the way I sometimes stopped moving entirely, overwhelmed by phantom sensations of connection. My nervous system remembering what it felt like to be part of something vast and terrible. But I could hear them during break periods, during the mandatory morning devotionals, during the shift change prayers. They sang hymns praising the Emperor's eternal vigilance, his endless sacrifice, his immortal will that protected humanity from the darkness, and all I could hear were in voices, line items. Resource allocation reports set to music. His will is eternal, meant the machinery continues consuming. His throne is forever, meant the postponement of death remains effective. We are nothing. He is all, meant your individual existence is irrelevant compared to the function you will serve when your time comes. Every hymn was a bill of lading. Every prayer was a requisition form. Every expression of faith was an acknowledgement of debt that would eventually come due, paid in screams converted to psychic energy. I tried to warn one man, but the words caught. Fear had been catalogued out of me. He was young, maybe 20, with the earnest expression of someone who still believed compliance would be rewarded, that faithful service would be recognized and valued. He worked at the adjacent terminal, processing shipping manifests with careful attention to detail. During a break period, he noticed me staring at nothing, my hands trembling slightly, aftershocks from the disconnection. Involuntary muscle spasms that occurred when my nervous system tried to reconnect to machinery that was no longer there. "Are you well?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. Should I summon a medica servitor? I wanted to tell him, wanted to explain what awaited him, what awaited all of us, what the hymns really meant, and where the missing quotas really went, and why the Imperium's hunger could never be satisfied. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out except a rasping sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a sob. My throat closed, my breath caught. My voice failed completely, as if something in my conditioning had reasserted itself, preventing disclosure even when I desperately wanted to speak. I tried again, tried to form words, to push past whatever barrier was stopping me. But my thoughts scattered, became confused, got lost in memories of dissolution and collective resonance. By the time I managed to gather them again, the moment had passed. The young man had returned to his work. My strange behavior dismissed as medical complications rather than attempted warning. I sat at my terminal, hands still trembling, understanding that they'd done something to me during integration. Not just physical damage, but psychological conditioning that made disclosure impossible. The knowledge remained, but the ability to share it had been systematically removed. I could know the truth. I could remember the machinery. I could understand the terrible purpose beneath the prayers, but I couldn't warn anyone. Couldn't spread the infection of knowledge. Couldn't compromise the system that required ignorance to function efficiently. Faith, I learned, is easiest to maintain when truth is rationed. The Imperium's genius wasn't in the machinery itself, impressive though that was. It was in the layered systems of control that ensured the machinery would always be fed, would always have fresh units to consume, would always sustain the eternal postponement of death that had become indistinguishable from damnation. They controlled through documentation, every life catalogued, every deviation noted, every potential unit tracked from birth to consumption. They controlled through faith, prayers that celebrated sacrifice, hymns that praised suffering, doctrine that made consumption feel like honor rather than horror. They controlled through ignorance, keeping the truth sealed at depth, accessible only to those already integrated into the machinery or those whose conditioning prevented disclosure. And they controlled through conditioning, breaking those few who learned the truth, rebuilding them with barriers that made sharing impossible, returning them to circulation as living warnings that the system would detect and neutralize any attempt at resistance. I was that warning now, a scar walking through the hive, a reminder that some things cannot be spoken, some truths cannot be shared. Some horrors must remain hidden to prevent the collapse of everything. Because what would happen if everyone knew? If the faith that sustained imperial culture dissolved, if workers refused their assignments, if parents hid their children, if the flow of willing units dried up and the machinery began to fail, the emperor would die. Finally, mercifully, he would be released from his eternal imprisonment, and the Imperium would collapse. The Astronomicon would fail. Warp travel would become impossible. Billions of worlds would be isolated, cut off, left to face the darkness alone. Humanity would fall, so the machinery had to continue. The consumption had to be sustained. The truth had to remain hidden. And I, damaged, altered, conditioned, I had to remain silent while others were processed, while the quotas were filled, while the hymns continued praising immortality that was really just postponed death funded by lives converted to psychic energy. I returned to my terminal and continued processing manifests. The numbers blurred together, became meaningless symbols, lost all connection to the reality they represented. And I was grateful for that mercy, grateful that I could work without thinking, function without understanding, exist without the terrible clarity that had defined my months of integration. The lie that sustained us wasn't really a lie. It was a mercy, a kindness that protected the ignorant from knowledge that would destroy them. Better not to know. Safer to believe. Easier to maintain faith when truth remained rationed, distributed only to those who'd already been broken enough to serve the system rather than disrupt it. I worked my shifts. I sang the hymns. I filed the reports. And I never spoke of what I'd learned. I write this because my nights are filled with that hum, growing louder each cycle. 3 years have passed since my release. 3 years of data, processing work, of silent shifts among colleagues who don't ask about my scars, of devotional attendance where I mouth prayers I can no longer believe but cannot refuse to recite. The physical damage has stabilized. My throat functions adequately for basic speech. My connection scars have faded from angry red to pale silver. My hands no longer tremble except during moments of stress or when the phantom sensations return. But the psychic damage continues to progress. I feel it in the quiet hours before shifts start, in the space between waking and sleep where consciousness hasn't yet fully reasserted control. That pull. That resonance. The machinery calling to whatever remains in me that still recognizes its frequency. The hum began 6 months ago. So faint at first I thought I was imagining it. A low vibration at the edge of perception, easy to dismiss as tinnitus or ventilation system noise, or psychological echo from my time integrated into the car. But it's grown steadily louder, more insistent, less dismissible. I know what it means. The Medica Servitor's assessment was correct. Psychic sensitivity increases with proximity exposure. Even disconnected, even returned to surface life, my nervous system retains its training. I've been marked, tuned. My consciousness still resonates with frequencies the machinery requires, and that resonance is growing stronger, as if distance and time mean nothing to the systems that fed on me once and will feed on me again. I feel the pull again, subtle but certain, as if my name is being recalculated. Not my birth name that's long gone, siphoned away during integration, but my designation, my file number. My place in the endless ledgers that track every potential unit from birth to consumption. 7739, Sigma integration complete released. Somewhere in the administratum stacks in data, cores buried beneath Terra's foundations, algorithms process that designation constantly. Monitoring my medical records, tracking my location, calculating my degradation rate and comparing it against current consumption requirements and projected future needs. The algorithms are patient and thorough. They know that released units with my psychic profile almost always require reintegration within 5 years. The cellular level resistance that made me unsuitable for continued consumption is temporary, a defensive reaction that fades as the body acclimates to its alteration. I'm in year 3. The algorithms have probably already flagged my file, noted the favorable trend in my psychic sensitivity readings, marked me as approaching optimal reprocessing parameters. A notice will come soon, maybe next month, maybe next week, maybe tomorrow morning, appearing in my queue with that familiar red stamp, an absolute bureaucratic courtesy. Subject 7739, Sigma integration complete, released is hereby summoned for maintenance re-evaluation. Report within standard time frame. The Emperor protects, and I will go, not because I want to, but because resistance is impossible, escape is monitored, and non-compliance would only trigger immediate enforcement rather than the gentle administrative processing I'll receive if I comply voluntarily. Immortality endures because we do not, and that is the bargain no one signs but everyone pays. I've had 3 years to process this truth, to understand the mechanism fully, to see the terrible logic that makes it all inevitable. The Emperor cannot die, because the machinery won't release him. The machinery cannot stop because the Imperium requires the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon requires psychic energy. Psychic energy requires consumption. Consumption requires units. Units require a population that believes sacrifice is sacred, suffering is meaningful, faith is protection rather than marking. Every component depends on every other component. Remove any single piece and the entire structure collapses, not gradually, but catastrophically, immediately, taking humanity's galactic civilization with it. So the machinery must continue. The consumption must be sustained. The immortality must be preserved even though it stopped being life millennia ago and became instead an endless postponement of death that requires an ocean of lives to sustain it. We are that ocean. Every human born into the Imperium is a potential drop in that vast sea of fuel, our existence measured in terms of eventual utility, our value calculated by how efficiently we can be converted into the psychic energy required to maintain systems that predate our species. Understanding of what those systems actually do. This isn't corruption, isn't heresy, isn't deviation from proper imperial function. This is proper imperial function. This is exactly what the Imperium was designed to do: process human consciousness into power, suffering into sustainability, lives into the postponement of death. Everything else, the prayers, the doctrine, the faith, the elaborate mythology of protection and purpose, exists only to make that processing efficient, to ensure the units come willingly, to prevent the kind of mass resistance that would disrupt the flow and cause the machinery to fail. When I am called again, there will be no protest, only compliance stamped clean. I know this with absolute certainty because I've watched myself over these 3 years. Watched how easily I've reintegrated into the system, how completely I've accepted my own inevitable reprocessing, how thoroughly the conditioning has reasserted itself even knowing what I know. I could run, could hide in the underhive's depths, could try to disappear among the mutants and criminals and those who've already chosen oblivion over imperial service. But I won't. The thought occurs and is immediately dismissed, not through conscious decision but through mechanisms carved so deeply into my psyche that they feel like personal choice rather than programming. I could resist when the notice comes, could refuse to report, force them to send enforcement, make my consumption difficult rather than efficient. But I won't. The idea of creating administrative complications feels worse than the idea of being consumed. That's how thoroughly they've conditioned me to value bureaucratic smoothness over personal survival. I could try to warn others, to spread the knowledge, to compromise the system through disclosure. But I can't. Literally cannot, my throat closing and thoughts scattering whenever I attempt it. The conditioning they installed during integration preventing transmission of truths that would destabilize the lie. So I will comply. When the notice comes, I will report. I will be processed with clinical efficiency. I will be reconnected to the apparatus, reintegrated into the choir, dissolved once more into the collective resonance that powers machinery, that prevents death that should have been mercy 10,000 years ago. This time, there will be no rejection, no cellular resistance. My nervous system has been trained, my psychic signature has been refined. My consciousness has been shaped into exactly what the machinery requires. I will provide optimal output for the full duration 20, maybe 21 months before degradation reaches terminal levels and they dispose of me. And after me, there will be others. Endless others. The scholars continue producing units. The ledgers continue documenting consumption. The quotas continue being met with mathematical precision. The machinery continues consuming, continues converting, continues sustaining immortality that has become indistinguishable from damnation. The Imperium will live, and I will become another quiet line item beneath it. In the grand ledgers that track consumption across millennia, I will be a single number. One unit among billions, processed according to protocol, consumed according to specification, disposed of according to regulation. My suffering will be notable only as data, psychic output measured in units, degradation rate compared against statistical averages, eventual disposal logged and filed in archives so vast that no human will ever access my specific record again. I will have mattered only as fuel, will have existed only to be burned, will have served the Emperor not through faith or devotion or conscious choice, but through the simple fact of being consumable, being available, being processed into the machinery that requires human consciousness the way a fire requires wood. And that's the truth beneath the prayers, beneath the hymns, beneath the 10,000 years of mythology and doctrine and faith. The Emperor doesn't protect us. We protect him, or rather, we protect the machinery that prevents his death. We are the sacrifice that sustains his immortality. We are the price of the Astronomicon. We are the fuel that powers the Golden Throne, and we have no choice but to continue burning, because the alternative is the collapse of everything, the darkness swallowing every human world, the end of our species' galactic existence. So the consumption continues. The machinery drinks, the choir sings. The Emperor remains suspended in his eternal moment between death and dissolution. And I, along with billions before me and billions after, I return to the machinery that will unmake me, dissolve me, convert me into the psychic energy required for one more day, one more year, one more millennium of immortality that stopped being life before my ancestors were born. The hum grows louder, my time approaches. When the notice comes, I will fold it carefully, place it in my inner pocket, collect my few possessions, and report as instructed. There will be no drama, no resistance, no final moment of defiance, just compliance. Stamped, processed, clean. The Emperor protects, the Emperor endures, and I will burn to make it so.